your FPS game. So for the technique, the main technique is best summarized by Bardos. But in my mind, Zeke and Bardos do not have conflicting ideas on static, and both precision and speed are vital to your success. There's a user in the AIM community named DRoy Light who does a great job of explaining why the fast flick plus micro adjust method of learning works so well. It's because when you're doing fast flicks, you are inviting the opportunity to create errors and learn from them. Micro adjusting is the built-in method to correct the error created from the fast flick, and over time you get better at landing closer to the target and micro adjusting more quickly when you miss the flick. So by using the Bard Pill method, you'll improve in static in the most optimal way, even if your scores are lower at first, or if it's frustrating to reset so much. If you find yourself rarely needing to micro adjust, you're likely practicing at a speed you're comfortable with. That's a good indication that you need to push yourself on speed to start introducing errors in your flicks and repeating the improvement process. That doesn't mean I recommend just aping or going all in on speed without any thought behind control. I would suggest pushing yourself about 20% on speed, get outside of your comfort zone, and when you're trying to improve your technique so you don't get fat and happy where you're at. Think of it as focusing on speed to raise the ceiling on your current skill in static and focusing on precision to hone that current skill. So is it better to under or over flick? This comes up a lot when discussing static. Zeke was the first to suggest under flicking being superior to an over flick because your momentum carries into an under flick and the inverse is not true. Crispus has canceled even went so far to create a playlist specifically geared toward training for under flicking. That said, I think people focus way too much on it, beginner and intermediate players especially. If you're at a skill level where this thing starts to matter, you don't need someone like me explaining how to get better at static dots. So I would suggest not focusing on trying to do one or the other. And definitely don't try to over or under flick. Your goal should always be to land on the target when you flick. I see this suggested sometimes and it makes me wonder what the hell people are thinking. So the common static scenario types you'll come across, one wall X targets is the most common, and that's things like one wall 4 targets, one wall 6 targets, one wall 2 targets, and tons of variations of those with smaller or larger bots. And then you've got the wide wall scenarios, again, wide wall X targets, which prioritize spacing the targets much further apart than the common one wall X targets, which forces you to use larger angles when you're flicking. You've got varied, which is becoming popular, and that is more like a time attack scenario. It starts you out with larger bots, and then over time in this scenario, you start getting smaller and smaller bots until they just totally disappear. Then you've got the hip fire and micro flick type scenarios. Those have smaller targets that are in clusters, and they prioritize your wrist movements and your micro flicking techniques. Pokeball is a really popular static type. You'll see it in all kinds of different variations, and it is a common recommendation to force you to work on your precision because it features bots that have a small amount of health that regenerates, so you can't just quickly move off of it after flicking to it. And then you've got the pressure sends, which are a higher difficulty type sends. If you've never run them before, you're in for a treat. They can be very challenging, especially for newer players, but they're some of the best ways to push yourself on speed while staying precise. As far as target sizes go, you generally don't want to train on bigger than TS size. You'll see a lot of variants of scenarios like 30% smaller, small, extra small for every scenario type. Smaller targets obviously increase the difficulty and prioritize precision and mouse control. Larger targets will generally prioritize speed. As far as routines go, static routines, they benefit from being run in a one-by-one fashion, in my opinion. I recommend integrating the Bard Pill method when you're running the static routines, and it might take you 10 minutes to get through a single scenario. Most likely you'll get stuck, so I would suggest running these routines for about an hour, doing Bard Pill for about 30 minutes, then switching to just regular training to get you through the routine. You can run these routines in total random, and if you don't get through the whole routine, that's generally fine. After all, you're working on your static technique. For beginners, the Voltaic Static Easy 1x1 is a fantastic routine. It's a great compilation of all the different types of static scenarios you'll want to practice on. You could just play this routine if it doesn't get stale for you in a 1x1 method until GM if you wanted, and still benefit from it. Getting into the intermediate and advanced, Voltaic has a static advanced 1x1, which is similar to the beginner, but then it starts to integrate the pressure scenarios, which, as I said before, they're more advanced and difficult for newer players, and they prioritize speed and accuracy. Eerie Cold 1x1. Eerie Cold, he's one of the top static aimers out there, and he's known for his excellent playlists across the spectrum. You'll see most of the same types of scenarios like what you would see in the Voltaic Static Advanced, and this is a common theme with static scenarios because they're fairly straightforward, and most of the best top scenarios have been figured out already. Trust Mix. Trust recently emerged as a top tier static aimer. He's competing with Bardos on most of the static leaderboards. As of recording this video, he just won first place in a major aim lab tournament for $35,000, just to give you an idea of how good this guy is. And he built a routine around improving at 1 while 6 target small specifically, but I think it's good for overall static improvement. You can run the routine as he built it, or you can just run it in a 1x1 fashion. Unan's flick accuracy, this is one I recommend a lot. Unan's has long been one of the best target switchers out there, and he's known for his insane mouse speed. As it happens, static target switch requires a lot of the same skills that static clicking requires. And if speed is your bottleneck for static, as it is with a lot of people, you can use his speed and flick accuracy routine. And remember, in target switch scenarios, you'll be running at a higher FOV. Anywhere between 115 and 125 Overwatch is. This is going to be part 2 of my 6-part series of learning each of the aim techniques that you need to be successful. For the technique, there's nothing fun and exciting like learning the Bard Pill method with this one, unfortunately, but you are going to primarily be using your static technique, the same type of technique that you use to approach static dots, where you're doing a fast flick and then a micro adjust. The main difference is you now have to micro adjust onto a target that's moving. One of the biggest mistakes I see for newer players is not to learn static technique first, or not apply it here. And you can really tell when there's a newer player trying to take down these bots because they'll be constantly chasing after bots, following the arc, for example, if they're doing bounce 180 over and over again, when they don't even realize that they're totally approaching it the wrong way. So one of the key things that you'll always see people say when trying to learn moving techniques, which is different from static techniques, is you don't want to flick to where a target's going to be and then wait for the bot. You don't want to wait to see where the bot's going to go and wait for the target to move into your crosshair, right? You can definitely get decent scores when you're following that technique, but you're gonna hit a ceiling at some point because eventually you have to be able to go really fast when you're taking down these bots, and you still need to be accurate. And you can't do that, especially with highly evasive bots like Pasu bots, where you just wait for them to come to your crosshair because they're going to do whatever the hell they want most of the time. And another common mistake that I see for newer players is they just ape, what's referred to as aping, where you just don't care about precision and accuracy at all, and you just click away as though, there's no penalty whatsoever if you miss. That can lead to building some bad habits. This isn't one wall 6 TE. You're not doing large, massive bots filling up your screen and just measuring your clicks per second. The key thing with moving dots is you want to do a fast flick, ideally arriving where the bot is going to land once your flick arrives at the destination, and then do a small amount of tracking to micro adjust onto the target. And this is one of the key things that people struggle with, is they don't do that small amount of tracking, or they don't learn that small amount of tracking that they need to do to micro adjust, because it's not like a static target where it's just sitting flat on your screen and it's clear where you need to micro adjust to, because it's not going anywhere. This time it is moving. So you need to understand the bot movement, or understand that the bot is going to move, and be able to move your crosshair with the bot movement in order to eliminate it during the micro adjustment. And at first it might take you a little bit longer to do this. It's just like how it is. And then over time, you're going to get this down to where you're doing it very fast, where it almost looks like you're just flicking and eliminating targets. If you look at some of the GM runs of people doing like Bounce 180 or Passu, it looks like they're just flicking from target to target, right? And they're not even doing any tracking to micro adjust because they're so good at it. So another key concept is called reading the map. And what that means is you're looking at not just your direct next target and hyper focusing on it and just trying to kill it no matter what, that you're looking at the entire set of targets that you have available to you on screen to figure out what is the optimal place that I should be moving my FOV and moving my crosshair to eliminate the most targets in the shortest amount of time. And this isn't just based on where they are. Like with static, they might just be in small clusters, so it's pretty obvious where you should go. But it's also based on their movement patterns and just kind of using your peripheral vision to see where they're going to be going next, so that you're not constantly just chasing these one-off bots all over the place and reducing your score. And that's where a lot of the ideas of target viability, as Christmas is Canceled calls it, comes into play. We'll talk a little bit more about each of the individual scenario types in a little bit, but like for example in Bounce 180, if you know that they're going to be in a predictable arc and the best time to hit them is when they are at the peak of their jump, the peak of their arc, because they had this little bit of time where they just seem like they're standing still, right? So that is when the target is most viable, right? So you want to be trying to prioritize being able to hit targets when they're at their most viable, and making the decisions about where to go next based on targets' viability and where they are in their bot pattern. Like if they're near the bottom of their jump in a Bounce 180 arc, that might be when it's more difficult for you to hit them, when it's at its high velocity, or if you're doing popcorn, when it's at its highest velocity, versus pausing kind of mid-air because it's changing, the gravitational pull, the so-called gravitational pull is going to be pulling down on it. It's reaching the height of its jump. That's when it's easiest for you to hit it. And to that end, there's some amount of learning to pattern learn that comes into play. And you might be thinking, well, that's memorizing, right? You're memorizing what bots are going to be doing and trying to predict. And no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your ability to understand where targets are going to be based on historical context. So if you sit there and you spend a lot of time learning the physical constraints of the environment that you're practicing in this case it's Kovacs, and you look at these bots like Passu bots, you know what their criteria and conditions are for what they can and can't do. They're gonna evasively move like in diagonal patterns, but they're not suddenly gonna jump really high in the air at a massive velocity, like like a vertical hell or something. Or it's not going to be like a popcorn scenario where it's just suddenly going to spike into the air. Even though you're not memorizing the bot and exactly where to place your crosshair at all time, you are understanding the conditions of what the bots are going to be doing. So that's why it's really important for Passu specifically doing the tracking invincible type variants, which we'll talk about in a little bit. is very important, because you kind of learn the physics and the constraints in the world that you have available to you and that you have to work with, so you isolate that. And it's just like if you're playing an FPS game, because in an FPS game there's certain things that you learn over time of like what is and isn't possible inside the game. You would never plan for, you know, having to track somebody at an insane speed if there is a limit to how fast players can go. So that's why I call it learning how to pattern learn, because you're creating these ideas in your mind of what is feasible and what is not feasible for the targets that you're selecting. When it comes to speed or accuracy, there's 3 real main types of bots that you'll see map makers have developed to help people prioritize accuracy or speed. The first one is a full reload, and what that is you get a certain number of shots, usually it's 3 shots, and then when you kill a bot you get a full reload, so you get 3 more opportunities to kill another bot, and so on and so forth, right? And normally that type of scenario is developed to allow people to prioritize working on speed, because you get opportunities to miss and you're not scored on your accuracy. That can also lead to bad habits, because you might end up getting a really low accuracy and still getting a good score. And when you play scenarios that do grade you on your accuracy, you won't be as successful. And then you've got another type of reload. Normally these are the goated, they're called goated scenarios, where instead of getting a full clip of the reload, you only get 1 shot back every single time you hit a target. So like, let's say you've got a clip of 3 and you use 2 of your 3 clip mag to hit a target. When you hit that target, you're gonna only have 2 bullets left. You won't get a full mag. Incrementally challenges you to keep hitting your targets, but still not grading you on accuracy. But it was created to kind of help people from just going too crazy on speed. And then you've got the never miss type scenarios, and those will either have a reset, a hard reset when you miss, after either 1 time or a certain number of times depending on the scenario, or they give you such a long reload, like a 10-second reload, where if you do miss, then I mean you might as well restart, because your score is going to be so low from all that time it took to reload. And then when it comes to the no reload scenarios, basically the accuracy focused scenarios, you've got the square root accuracy methods, which is the most popular method nowadays as the time of making this video. Don't exactly know how it works, but it's math-based formula that isn't linear. So it's not as though every single shot is a penalty against your accuracy, that there's some kind of formula approaching a limit where your accuracy is incrementally penalized over time. And then you've got the traditional accuracy method, where it's literally every shot is a penalty against your accuracy. And then you've got the no penalty scenarios, which are just shoot as many times as you like, there's no reloads, and there's no penalty against your accuracy. And normally those aren't obviously benchmark scenarios, and they're really meant for helping you focus on your speed, and they're normally smaller bots which are really hard to hit, so it's not like you can just spam and benefit from it anyway. In the first video about static dots, we talked about the Bard pill method, and resetting after you miss a certain number of times, resetting after the first 10 seconds of the scenario if you miss. And can you do that here? Not directly, right? I don't think you can directly, because there's always going to be some amount of accuracy, lower accuracy, that's just inevitable, no matter how good you are at these scenarios. There has been a couple of scenario types invented recently, which I think are worth investigating. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but the never miss scenarios that I mentioned earlier can be valuable. They're extremely frustrating to play, depending on how many shots you get before it reloads, because it will literally reload the scenario if you miss. So good luck ever finishing a run. But there's also variations that like Raspberry has put together, which has a long reload after a certain number of misses, where you can keep playing, but the score is so affected that it's not worth keeping, but it does let you keep playing. So some of that frustration associated with constantly having to reset can be eliminated with these, and I like those.
There's another user by the name of C7, which recently put out some interesting scenarios, which I'm going to talk about in a little while as well, but also along that same idea of not a full reset if you miss. So as you're doing these scenarios, notice that you're going to have a lot of jitter and shakiness. This is very normal. There's a lot of fingertip aim at play here. And that is an area that a lot of people have underdeveloped, myself included. It's to be expected, and that's something that you're going to be building up and fixing over time. So if anything, it's good that you see that because it reveals where your weaknesses are and what you need to improve on. And one of the things I'll be talking about in a little bit is for all of the movement type scenarios, I think it's very important for improvement. Prioritize working on multi-click to kill scenarios. Let's say you're playing Bounce 180. Normally it's one shot, one kill. There's variations of those scenarios where it takes you 3 shots to kill each bot. And why I think that is very important is it helps you with prioritizing tracking the bot after a flick. It's important to be able to quickly flick between targets and then move on if you miss. It's also very important to learn that micro adjustment in moving dots is not the same as it is in static dots, and you have to kind of follow the bot a little bit after you flick. And that's where I think the multi-click scenarios really help you. Main scenario types out there. The most common one is called Pasu. There's tons of different flavors of Pasu, but it's essentially what I would refer to as evasive bots. There's other ones out there like Psalm Click, there's OCH Click, Tune Click if you're looking at the RA benchmarks. So it's not just Pasu, it just happens to be that Pasu is definitely without question the most popular bot type when it comes to evasive. When you're first trying out Pasu, there's 2 important things to prioritize. The first one is playing the slower bots versions, because you really need to kind of understand what the bot movement is going to be like. You're not memorizing. Again, this isn't memorizing, but you're learning in your brain what it means for Pasu bots to move around and what you need to prioritize in these scenarios. And then the second is doing Pasu track invincible. You want to start out with the larger bots at first, and then slowly over time as you get better, decrease the bot size, because it's going to be harder for you, and it also helps you work on precision a lot more and accuracy. It's easier to be accurate with larger bots, and as you get better aim, you'll mostly be focusing on large bots just to help you increase your speed. If you're doing any type of TS sends or like target switching scenarios, to do very low time to kill, low TTK on the bot, so you're not training tracking as often. In Pasu, I think no matter what, you're going to be training tracking more frequently than you would in like Bounce 180 or Popcorn. Like I said, there was somebody by the name of C7. He even put together a document, which I'll provide a link to, which goes into detail about all of these different scenarios that he created and the reasoning behind each one of them. So you can look at them and then look at his justification for why he created them and what it helped him with, and then look at your own training and what you need to work on and see if they will help you. As I was thinking through this and looking at this guy's scenarios and trying to figure out how to communicate what people need to work on, especially variety of skill sets, so the beginner side and then the more advanced side, I just went ahead and put together a routine. And I'll talk through this. I just called it You Better Move. So the idea I had with this playlist was basically to run it in a progressive style. I made it so benchmark scenarios can run those multiple times just to get those feelings of accomplishment as you are getting better at the benchmark scenarios, which is, I think, is important to keep your training going. And it's easier at the top half and then more difficult at the bottom half, but the way that it's presented, you can run it in order, and I put it in a specific order. You could also just run it 1x1 style if you wanted. I think both have their benefits. And so the way that I started out is you start at the top with like easy slow bots. And I think as you're learning Pasu and moving in general, you should focus on the easier, slower bots. And then an easier
tracking invincible of one bot. I use Passu Track Invincible V2. If you're having difficulty with the bots, they can help you build and understand how you should be playing the scenarios. And then I like the 3-shot R4. That's the scenario that requires multiple clicks to kill the bots, individual bots. And it gets you in the thought process of being able to track the bot after flicking to it slightly. It's very important that you kind of learn that. You don't want to just sit there and run that endlessly, though, because flicking between targets after killing them is an important tempo habit to learn. I went with Passu Voltaic Large TS Hard. It's got Pokeball bots that you need to kill, and they have a small amount of health that regens, essentially. Helps you with the idea of lingering a little bit after flicking to a target in Passu, which is important. It's not like with Static, where you know exactly where the bot's going to be, so it's easier for you just to do the flick and then the micro correct. In Passu and evasive moving dots in general, there is a lot of awkward movement that's going to be hard for you to track after you micro adjust. So having that little bit of regen prevents you from going all in on speed and just aping and focusing too much on flicking. And then I put Passu Voltaic LR3E, which is the never miss type variant that I was talking about. It gives you multiple chances to kill a bot. Once you have a reload, it essentially ends the scenario because the reload is so long, but you can continue with the scenario if you so choose. And then I just put the benchmark scenario, Passu Voltaic Easy. And then basically you just start over again with this same concept progressively, except this time the bots are much more difficult. And I went with 1 while 5 targets Passu Extra Jumbo instead of a slow bot scenario version of Passu. This one is good to practice because it helps you with developing speed and tempo as you're flicking between the bots. Again, once you start to get to the higher difficulty levels of Passu and moving dots in general, there's a lot of flicking and kind of floating over the dots that you'll need to learn and practice. To get the high scores, you can't just keep going at a slower speed. And then went with 1 wall T Passu Raspberry V1 Invincible for like the tracking one. You can choose, if you want even more difficulty, you can go with like the Passu ADHD versions, which are out there, or like Packy Track. Definitely options for if you want the difficulty. And then you've got Passu Voltaic Small, 3-shot R5. And this is really when customization can come into play. There's a lot of different variants. There's smaller, even smaller bot versions of them. There's different amounts of shots that you can give yourself. There's different amounts of reloads. So feel free to experiment with that. Try to just keep the overall concept behind the playlist the same, but you can certainly swap in and swap out scenarios. And if this is too hard for you overall, then you don't have to run this at all. You could actually skip all the second half of the routine after Passu Voltaic Easy. And then I inserted a couple non-Passu scenarios that are still moving dots, like Solemn TS Angelic Click. I like OCH Click HS. They're also evasive bots, and it gives you something new to try and a different movement pattern to work with. Passu Voltaic Small Reload or Passu Small Goaded are very common training scenarios that people like to play, especially at the higher difficulty. I went with TAM Target Switch Control Hard Small as kind of the micro tracking that you need once you switch to a bot. You could also go with something like TAM Speed 2BP. That's a pretty popular one. I think that would work better if you want to get that wrist kind of micro flick control in the playlist somewhere. I think it's important. I went with the Raspberry versions near the bottom of the playlist for the Invincible, and the just regular Passu Click versions are very difficult versions. And then finally, you can do Passu Voltaic as many times as you want. But overall, just the idea is to run this in a progressive way. If you can run the hard versions of the scenarios, then I suggest that you just run it top to bottom, or you can just clip out the beginner part of it, quote unquote. If you're already like Diamond Plus in Passu Voltaic, then there's really no reason to run the top half of the playlist. So it's meant to be customized, but also just try running it as it's built. That's a lot to talk about for just Pasu and evasive bots. We can talk more now about the other scenario types. I think it's important, though, the reason why I focus so much on Pasu, because it's really the most difficult moving dot type that people struggle with. It's got the most amount of aim techniques that you need to develop. Bounce 180 is a bit more straightforward from my perspective. So we could talk about Bounce 180 being another really popular scenario type for moving dots. If you've learned the technique for the Pasu, then Bounce 180 is very similar in terms of how you should approach it. The biggest difference being with Bounce 180 is your target selection is a lot more based on predictable bot paths and less on evasive bots. The Bounce 180 bots, you pretty much know where they're going at all times. I mean, they do kind of this weird parabola movement sometimes in the air, which is hard to get. But the main thing that you want to focus on with Bounce 180 is tempo and leaving your crosshair at the top of the arc where the bots are going to move so that you can continue clicking on the bots and not focus as much on tracking them. In fact, most of the times you don't want to be tracking them. If you look at the high level players that are running these scenarios, they pretty much never chase any bots ever. They're just going for as many kills as they can possibly get. So it's quick flicking and it's keeping the crosshair near the arc and shooting them at the easiest place to hit them, which is at the top of their arc. And it's very tempo based. You move on if you miss. You don't sit there and keep trying to chase individual bots. As for practicing this, you can do Bounce 180 like 3-click type scenarios, similar to what benefits you in Pasu, where it requires multiple clicks to kill the same bot. That helps, again, with not overly focusing on the fast flicks that you would do with like a static. Remember, with moving, there is an amount of target selection, the dynamic nature of the bots. You need to be able to do a micro adjustment on a moving target. So getting in that frame of mind will help you a lot. You can also do kind of Bounce 180 TS type scenarios with a small amount of regen. Basically the same types of concepts that you would apply to practicing Pasu. The one difference being I would not focus on like Bounce 180 tracking or invincible tracking for this. It's just a different concept than what you are learning in Pasu, because the bots aren't as evasive and you're not really following the bot through the entirety of its arc. You're really wanting to focus on hitting it at the top of its arc and then move on. Popcorn is, again, this is a difficult scenario for a lot of people. It's very precise. This, out of all of the different moving dot scenarios, Popcorn requires the most amount of precision, and that's what most people struggle with. And ironically, a lot of times people will get really good scores in Popcorn first out of all of the dynamic scenarios, and I think that's because it's more intuitive how to get better at Popcorn. And the main concept that you want to focus on with Popcorn is treating it more like a precision scenario and a smoothness scenario. Christmas is Canceled talks about this in his video as well in a much more succinct manner than me. So instead of constantly flicking around to the different bots and then moving on if you miss, like you would in a Bounce 180 type scenario or just static dots in general, with this you want to very smoothly and precisely approach the bot. You can definitely flick, especially if your next target is like a wide swing from your current crosshair location. As you're approaching the bot, with your crosshair, you want to very kind of smoothly and slowly and precisely acquire the target before hitting your shot. And think of it like if you're playing an FPS game and you're playing with a very strong snipe type weapon on a target that's really far away, you want that shot to hit no matter what, right? Like that gun probably has a really long reload because it's very strong. It's like a one hit, one kill type weapon. So you don't get a lot of opportunities and it gives away your position when you shoot. So you want that shot to hit. And that's really what you're practicing when you're doing Popcorn, is you're practicing your precision, you're practicing your accuracy. It's not a speed scenario. Same thing with the Bounce 180 in terms of how you want to hit
the bots at the height of their arc, because it has such a variety in their bounce and their jumps and like how low and how high they are. You can't follow the concept of just leaving your crosshair around the arc of the jump and knowing that they're going to be there. And in general, you don't want to move your mouse at a high velocity after you've acquired your target and you're trying to kill it. You don't want to keep following the bot going down at a high velocity in its arc. For example, you want to try to always click when it's at the apex of its jump. And so for other types of scenarios, you can do like low TTK tracking versions. You can do the no reload versions. There's popcorn voltaic practice versions. There is the RA versions, which are give you multi-clicks. I think can be beneficial so that you're not constantly having to reload because you're missing. Just don't go too crazy with the idea of like you have as many hits as you want. It just helps when you're practicing. Treat it as though you're still have the one long reload when you're practicing. And the final dynamic bot type is floating heads. This is probably the most straightforward of all of the types. Got like floating heads, timing 400% is probably the most popular one out there. And then you've got the different 50% HPs. PureG just released their benchmarks and they have a scenario called horizontal clicking, which is great for practicing this as well. This is definitely going to be a lot more of your typical static technique that you're applying here because the bots are moving in such a predictable path. You are flicking and then micro adjusting just like you would in static, and you're flicking to where the target's going to be when you flick. That's essentially what you want to aim for. And you still want to avoid the bad habit of waiting for the target to come into your crosshair. That is not the method to improve. If you ever see yourself doing that, just tell yourself not to do it and then just keep repeating that mantra over and over until you don't do it. It's really important not to develop that habit. There's so many different variants of the floating head versions. There's not any special set of scenarios that I would really recommend to improve in this. You can always focus on your static technique and go back to the static video on suggestions that I offered for improving your static, including the Bard Pill method, because this is really going to be testing more of your target selection. So some other routines that you could practice, you can use Kraski's Pasu 1x1 playlist. That's one of the better ones that I've ever seen. You normally don't see a lot of dynamic focused routines out there. For either the Kraski's 1x1 or my playlist, if you want to play them, don't overplay them. Like, don't just focus so much on dynamic only, because a large part of your technique is actually developed in static. This is more of challenging your reading skills, your precision, your accuracy, your fingertip aim. Fusa also has a great clicking routine, which is largely dynamic. It's just called Bloop. Fusa, a lot of people might not be familiar with who Fusa is. He's kind of been in and out of the AIM scene recently. He has most of the top scores and most of the hard scenarios. An amazing aimer. The routine that he developed is very difficult. Just know that in advance. If you are of a higher skill level, then this is good for you. But if you're not, you're going to struggle. And then Dan has a precision and reactivity routine. It has a variety of scenarios that are really not focused around clicking, but it also does have scenarios that are, like Popcorn Voltaic, for example, practice, Psalm TS Angelic Click, Pasu Small Pure. So check it out. It, again, is on the harder side. There is an amount of developing your reactivity, which is going to help you in Pasu type situations or evasive clicking in general, because of the small wrist movements that you have to learn to kind of reacquire a target that is moving in a place other than what you expect. So practicing reactivity is certainly going to help you. It's not going to work against you. Again, dynamic is not one trick. You don't want to sit there and just constantly practice dynamic alone. Some of the most common mistakes that I see for people that are practicing and playing dynamic clicking scenarios is not focusing on accuracy enough. the penalties for having a low accuracy is much harsher than you might realize. You want to resist spam clicking. Pasu especially is really built to test your precision and accuracy. Most of the dynamic dot scenarios are really testing your ability to miss less, to have your shots be more meaningful when you flick to a target. So you just have to remember that it's not speed training, it's not your clicks per second training. It's the same in static, it's just that in static it's a lot more apparent because the targets aren't sitting still. Focus a lot on that first hit mattering and being the one that will hit. So that's why learning the micro adjustment on a moving target after you flick to a target and slightly tracking, being prepared to slightly track after a flick is very important to learn. Another common mistake I see is people chasing individual bots, constantly chasing after bots. This is still definitely a tempo-based scenario. You got to learn to flick and micro adjust and click and move on if you miss, instead of just constantly, trying to kill that one bot that you're dead set on. Newer players also hyper focus on individual targets. Instead of reading the overall map, you want to be looking at what the best place is for your crosshair to be to maximize the number of targets that you're going to be killing in not just your current target, but the next immediate targets that you're going to be shooting for. This happens a lot where I see especially the bots start bumping up against the side and there's 3 or 4 different bots right near them, and they're so focused on that one that seems like an easy kill because it's sitting up against the edge, and then they just keep missing because they're focusing so much on that one bot. You need to be thinking about how many you're going to be able to kill in the shortest amount of time. Another big one is the obvious one, which is waiting for the bot to enter the crosshair. This is probably the biggest mistake that I see. You gotta get out of that habit. It's just like when tracking, they always say, to assume the bot is going to keep going in the same direction instead of predicting it. Think of it just like that. Like, it is such an important habit not to develop that you need to keep reminding yourself of it all the time. Don't wait for the bot to enter your crosshair. And the final thing that I see is not picking the most viable targets, especially in bounce. They won't be thinking about bot spawns. They won't be thinking about, what the most optimal set of targets are to hit. So you'll see these constant wide swings from side to side in 180 degrees, hitting one bot and then going all the way to the other side of the map to hit another bot, and then over and over again. And you're just killing your scores because even though your technique is good, so you're not killing enough bots to spawn more bots to get that score up there, right? So it's another important thing. And it's not just about developing the score and getting a better score. It's nice, it's good for those dopamine hits and having, feeling like you're getting better and a sense of accomplishment. But it's also learning how to use a tempo-based gun, because there's a lot of tempo-based single-click guns that are very effective in FPS games. So you need to be able to, track a moving target and keep hitting it, right? Or if there's multiple targets that you want to do a little bit of damage to each, you want to be able to do that. And if you're not practicing that skill, then you're going to be afraid of using those types of guns. So it's developing your confidence there as well. So I hope this was useful for you. The next video that I'm going to put out is going to be on static target switching. Eventually we'll have all 6, and then you can just watch them start to finish, and hopefully it'll help you develop your aim technique. Reactivity tracking is going to be dead last. Make sure to follow me on Twitter if you don't already. I post a lot on there, and like and subscribe. Tell people about my content if you think that they'll benefit from it, and I'll see you next time. Okay, I know it's been a long time. Everybody has been waiting patiently or impatiently, as the case may be, for me to release